On July 31, 2023, mushroom expert Camille Truong was searching for answers. There'd been a poisoning at a lunch in a small country town, and she had been asked to examine a sample of leftover food. She'd left work when a request came in to test the meal. Luckily, Dr. Truong had a home set up and the sample was sent over to her. She cleaned a bench and pulled out her equipment.
I have a small microscope setting in my house, so I went there. I always clean up the bench and then I use gloves. I use a small tray and tweezers that are also sterilised with alcohol wipes. I opened the package, saw it was a food item which contained mushrooms inside, so with tweezers, I carefully picked out the little pieces of mushroom on the tray and then I studied them under the microscope.
After she examined the food, she put them in her fridge. And she tested them again on August 2. What she found, along with her other investigations into death caps, she told to the court today in the trial of Erin Patterson. I'm Brooke Grebert-Craig, and this is The Mushroom Cook. We've just finished day 11, and once again, I'm joined by my colleague, court reporter Laura Placella.
Hey, Brooke.
How are you going?
Yeah, not bad. Getting through.
Now, Laura, we've had some luck finding voice actors that sound like the witnesses on the stand, but unfortunately not this time.
No, unfortunately not. As our listeners heard at the top of the episode, we heard from a second mushroom expert today, and she speaks with a French accent. But alas, we don't have any French speakers in our office, so we had to make do.
That's right. So Dr. Truong was the on-call mycologist at Victorian Poisons Information Centre on July 31. She was sent the leftovers of that beef Wellington dish that was fished out of Erin's bin by a local police officer.
We heard last week some details around this operation. One of the local cops spoke to Erin over the phone and got the access code to her front gate. Erin directed him to one of her outside bins and said that would be the place he would most likely find leftovers of the beef Wellington. And after donning some gloves and having a search through the bin, he found a Woolworths bag that contained the leftovers.
But today the jury was told more about where the leftovers of that meal ended up after it was taken in an ambulance with Erin to Monash Medical Centre.
Yes, these leftovers have gone on quite the journey. So from the bin at Erin's Leongatha home, like you said, Brooke, they've been taken to Leongatha Hospital. From there, transported in an ambulance with Erin to Monash Medical Centre in Melbourne. And then from Monash Medical Centre, they've been ferried in an urgent taxi to the city to the office of the Royal Botanic Gardens.
And then what happened with them?
So Dr. Truong works for the Royal Botanic Gardens and she's a mycologist, just like Dr. Tom May, who we heard from yesterday. And she received a phone call from Dr. Laura Muldoon, who worked at Monash Medical Centre, about these leftovers. Dr. Muldoon had sent Dr. Truong a photo and asked her whether or not from that photo she could identify whether there were death caps in that meal, considering 4 people had fallen seriously ill after consuming the beef Wellington lunch. But Dr. Truong said that there was not enough information from that photo for her to be able to draw any conclusions. And the court heard more today about her thought process after she spoke with Dr. Muldoon. These are her words, it's not her voice.
I did indicate to her that if the mushroom were coming from a shop or a supermarket, it was extremely unlikely and probably impossible to be death cap mushrooms, because those mushrooms only grow in the wild, whereas the mushrooms that you buy in the supermarket are cultivated, are grown in culture, and death cap mushrooms cannot be grown in cultures.
She went on to say,
I also told her that there were absolutely no sighting of death cap mushrooms in Victoria during the last months, so based on the information that I received, it was highly unlikely to be a case of death cap poisoning.
So Laura, you said Dr. Truong couldn't make any conclusions. What was her next steps?
So I mentioned earlier that the leftovers were ferried to her office at the Royal Botanic Gardens, but she hadn't heard from staff at Monash Medical Centre for a while, so she actually went home. The leftovers arrived at her office and she wasn't there, so she then had to arrange for them to be brought to her home. But rest assured, Dr. Truong had a microscope at home, as our listeners would have heard at the top of the episode, so she was well equipped to be able to take a look at these leftovers from the comfort of her house.
And what did she find?
So after she used some tweezers to extract some pieces of the mushroom, she popped them under her microscope and took a look. She was asked today in court by Crown Prosecutor Nanette Rogers whether or not she found any pieces of death cap mushrooms, and she said she didn't. Now, this may be a good time to remind our listeners that the prosecution allege Erin served individual beef Wellingtons that day at that lunch. Beyond that, the prosecution also alleged that her serve of that beef Wellington, that individual serve, did not contain death cap mushrooms. But again, to also remind our listeners, the defence claimed that what happened at that lunch was a tragedy and a terrible accident, and Erin has pleaded not guilty to all charges.
That's right, Laura. So Dr. Truong did find another type of mushroom in those leftovers that she was examining. What were they?
So she told the court after examining these mushrooms on July 31 at her home, she put them in her own fridge at her house, and it was 2 days later that she took them out and brought them back to her office to examine them further. She told the court today, upon examining them for the second time, she identified them as field mushrooms, and she went on to say that these are mushrooms that are very typically found at your everyday supermarket.
The leftovers were then collected by the Department of Health on August 2. So before the jury heard from Dr. Truong, mycologist Tom May returned to the stand and continued his evidence from yesterday. Laura, can you remind the listeners who Dr. May is?
So he is an internationally recognised fungi specialist, and he's actually colleagues with Dr. Truong. They both work at Royal Botanic Gardens, where Dr. May has worked for over 30 years. His cross-examination continued today, and he was brought to another fatal case of death cap mushroom poisoning. The court heard last year there was a Victorian woman who picked some mushrooms from her front yard that she cooked in a meal that she served to her and her son. The jury heard that she first picked mushrooms from her yard in April 2024, and she cooked them and everything was fine. Her and her son didn't fall ill. But then a month later, she noticed that mushrooms were growing in the same location in her yard, so she picked them again and cooked them again. But this time, they both got very ill following the meal. They were both taken to hospital, but unfortunately, the woman died.
And Dr. May told the jury that he was familiar with this particular case. Why is that, Laura?
The court heard that this was the subject of a coronial finding, and the coroner recommended there to be more public health messaging about the dangers of consuming wild mushrooms.
And in particular, he was contacted by the Department of Health to help with these public health messages. And Dr. May was also asked about the smell of death cap mushrooms.
He told the court that he's actually dried death cap mushrooms before, and he was asked by the prosecution what they smell like, and he said very unpleasant in his opinion.
Okay, now moving on to more medical evidence. The jury heard from an intensive care specialist. His name was Professor Andrew Burton. He actually examined Erin's medical records. What did he find?
The first thing he was questioned about today was whether or not Erin had ever been diagnosed with cancer. And to remind our listeners, it's the prosecution case that Erin invited her lunch guests over to her house on the pretense that she had cancer, as a way to explain to them why the children were not in attendance. However, the defence have suggested that Erin never told the lunch guests she had cancer, but rather that she had a suspected diagnosis. So Professor Burton was asked today about this, and he said that after reviewing Erin's medical records, he found no evidence that she had been diagnosed with cancer. The court specifically heard that Erin had completed a cervical screening test in March 2023, and the results of that had come back normal. Professor Burton told the court that these tests are only required every 5 years, and she would most likely have been told that.
Through Erin's medical records, Professor Burton also found no evidence of toxic mushroom poisoning after she was admitted to hospital following the lunch. We touched upon that in yesterday's episode. Now, Laura, we saw the return of the dehydrator being mentioned in court.
Yes, the dehydrator has been missing in action, but it made a return today, and that was through the evidence of Darren Canty. He is an operations manager at the Dasma Group, and this organisation run the Coonawarra Transfer Station and Landfill, so essentially one of the local tips in the area. Now, our listeners might remember the tip from the opening addresses. Defence barrister Colin Mandy said that Erin admitted she lied to police about dumping the dehydrator at the tip. Mr. Canty told the court that he got a call from police on August 4 who were making inquiries about a person who had gone to their tip to drop something off on August 2, so 2 days earlier. He said he reviewed the CCTV footage from that day. This footage was shown to the jury, and in it you can see a red four-wheel drive pull up to the tip. A woman who was dressed in a grey sweater and cream pants is seen getting out of the car, going to her boot and taking out an item. She then walks into a shed at the tip and about 20 seconds later re-emerges without that item. She then gets back into her car and the footage stops.
Mr. Canty then got his colleague to go through the tip and find this item that was dropped off. The colleague then found a dehydrator and he told his boss.
The jury was then shown a photo of the dehydrator. It was lying on its side, and Mr. Canty then said he rang the police to tell them what he had found, and before long they had come to the site to pick it up.
That's right. So the police actually seized that dehydrator on August 4.
But I'm sure this won't be the last we hear about the dehydrator.
So that's all the evidence from today, and tomorrow we're expected to hear more from expert witnesses. So we'll be back then with another episode, and in the meantime, go to themushroomcook.com.au for more.